Today, we're continuing with Galatians chapter 5, but it's not going to sound like the tail end of Galatians chapter 5 as you know it. So if you want to figure out what I'm saying from the message, look at the front of your bulletin, and that's where you'll find the words that you're accustomed to. And I'm going to Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 through the end, where it says, "But what happens when we live God's way? He brings gifts into our lives, much the same way that fruit appears like in an orchard. Things like affection for others, exuberance about life, serenity. We develop a willingness to stick with things, a sense of compassion in the heart, and a conviction that a basic holiness permeates things and people. We find ourselves involved in loyal commitments, not needing to force our way in life, but we're able to marshal and direct our energies wisely. Legalism is helpless in bringing this about. It only gets in the way. Among those who belong to Christ, everything connected with getting our own way and mindlessly responding to what everyone else calls necessities is killed off for good. It's crucified. Since this is the kind of life we have chosen, the life of the Spirit, let us make sure that we do not hold it as an idea in our heads or a sentiment in our hearts, but work out its implications in every detail of our lives. That means we will not compare ourselves with each other as if one of us were better and another were worse. We have far more interesting things to do with our lives. Each of us is an individual. This is the Word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Quick quiz. John Bennett knows it because he did the math with this thing. How many years old will we be tomorrow? 246. Now, that's a long time for a nation to flourish and remain free. But if you look at our history and the context of the world, man, we got a short history. When you think about other nations, Egypt, China, Japan, Greece, even the city of Rome, all make America's history seem just very short. I want you to think about 4 men and the brief time that we've been a nation. When Thomas Jefferson died, Abraham Lincoln was a teenager. He was 17. He just learned how to drive. When Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, Woodrow Wilson was even younger. He's younger than Will. Woodrow Wilson was 8. When Wilson died, Ronald Reagan, he was just beginning his teen years. He was 12 years old. So you see, with those 4 men, we traverse almost, very close, to the whole history of our country as far as us being the United States of America. And the lives of these men take us back all the way to the beginning. We are so young. I think we ought to say that together. That would make us all feel good, but we won't. And we stand, though, no matter how young we are, very tall among these nations because of the principles, the basic tenets upon which we were established. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that's the way the Declaration of Independence, which we celebrate tomorrow, begins. And folks, please don't let anyone fool you. Our freedoms ought to be celebrated, and they need to be celebrated. There are so many ministers and churches today that don't allow patriotism in the pulpit. Well, I stand here before you to tell you, I am not one of those pastors or preachers. I celebrate with you today the freedoms which God has blessed America with. Now, I can't tell you whether God has blessed us with liberty, and because of that blessing we are free, or maybe we have wisely and simply built our liberty based on the biblical principles and precepts, and that has allowed us to be free. But it really doesn't make any difference, because our freedom that we all enjoy is from God. Now, let me issue a warning, and I touched on this last week as we looked at the first part of Galatians 5. With freedom, you'll remember, what did I say, comes great responsibility. We're not free to live lives of excess. We're not free to pursue our own selfish ends. We can't do that. Our independence does not make us freewheeling. It's all about me, people. Paul put it perfectly. He said, "You, my brothers, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge in the sinful nature." Well, what is true for the church is true for America. Freedom, liberty, demands civility. Freedom requires righteous, good behavior. So tomorrow, the 4th of July, Independence Day, let's celebrate freedom and civility. Well, let's look first at freedom. Paul was a champion of liberty or freedom. He traveled all through the Roman Empire. What was he doing? He was starting churches. The Galatian church might just be the most important one, because it stands right in the middle of the empire that his message of Christianity was the most vigorously opposed. Now here's the story. Here's what happened. During Paul's missionary journeys, he founded a number of churches in Asia Minor. Asia Minor today, and Mark will affirm this, is the country of Turkey, pretty much. And those converts to Christianity, some of them were Jews, some of them were not Jews. They accepted the gospel just as Paul preached it. And the basic message of Paul to them you can find in Galatians chapter 2, where it says, "Man is not justified by observing the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ." Paul must have been an adherent of that KISS principle. Keep it simple, stupid, because that's pretty darn simple. But, however, there were some Christians, Jews, who believed that Paul went too far. And they came in after Paul had left, and he told these new converts that while Paul was right in what he said, they kind of said, but he was only half right. They would have to observe, their thinking was, certain ceremonial practices of the Old Testament which they claimed were still binding upon the new Christians, upon the church. And they referred specifically to the act of circumcision. And Paul's response to these men, which we call Judaizers, is the book of Galatians that we're exploring today and last week. And Paul's warnings to those followers have resounded over the entire time since Paul to us. He says, "Mark my words. I, Paul, tell you that if you let yourself be circumcised, Christ is of no value to you at all. Again, I declare to every man who lets himself be circumcised that he is obligated to obey the whole law. You who are trying to be justified by law have been cut off from Christ, and you have fallen away from his grace." Now, I found a couple of interesting commentators that added this to it, and I find it interesting that there's a little bit of satire here in this admonishment. And that word that's translated cut off or severed is used here by Paul to mean separating oneself from the gospel. But it's also the exact same word used to describe the act of circumcision. So in other words, if those folks back then observed circumcision, they also circumcise themselves. They sever themselves from Christ. Folks, think about that. Paul takes this serious. Paul is not kidding. He's serious about freedom. Well, those men who are the framers of our great nation were just as serious about their political freedom and about their religious freedom. In fact, if you look, they made very little distinction between the two. And that's why the Declaration of Independence says that liberty is a right endowed not by nature, but by God Himself. Remember what Patrick Henry said. You probably learned it about in the 4th grade. Will, you may know this. When he said, "I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." We're serious, friends, about our freedom. Why? Why are we so serious other than it's enjoyable? We like it. Well, mainly because we are called to be free. Those are Paul's words, and they're deeply, deeply theological. But they're also the foundation, the very bedrock of our country, and that's what it's founded on. God gives to us, human beings, freedom. We're made in His image. We're free to live, free to think, free to act. And in Jesus, He gives us freedom from what? Freedom from the law, which had bound the Jewish people for so long. He gives us the grace to be at liberty with ourselves and our sinful nature. Now, let's stop and think just for a minute. There's always going to be those who have opposed freedom. They were way back then, they're right now. Paul faced it with those folks I just talked about, the Judaizers. They were right there. Martin Luther, back in the Reformation time, faced it at the Diet of Worms. Abraham Lincoln fought against it at Gettysburg. Well, he didn't fight, but the country was at war. And guess what? It happened right here in Memphis, right downtown, with Martin Luther King. He fought against it. John Kennedy, in his inaugural address, warned the enemies of liberty. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we will pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, in order to assure the survival and the success of freedom. So let's celebrate our freedom. But we can't forget to celebrate our responsibility to civility. And I chose these words, freedom and civility, with a little bit of thought, because they recall not just the good old days, but all of us, except Will, remember when we lived in a kinder, gentler day. You know, there was more niceness, for lack of a better term. And I, want to draw your attention to what we were founded on, because our freedoms that we enjoy carry a heavy burden. The great thinkers, going back a long way, recognize this. Listen to some of the voices from the past. Peter Marshall, that name should resonate with some of you. He was the chaplain of the Senate many years ago. Great book, great movie, A Great Man Called Peter, was about Peter Marshall. You may be more familiar, some of you girls, with his wife, Catherine Marshall. And these were important people. But Peter Marshall says this: the choice before us is plain: Christ or chaos, conviction or compromise.